Hey guys, you know, doing this uncut and unscripted and on the fly, I just wanted to come on here and talk about, Spike and Rarity's relationship one more time. And of course, I'm going to talk about it numerous times and even do PMVs about it down the road. So, so expect that. But I wanted to come on here because recently, as of tonight, last night, I watched Linkara's latest review, a three-part video on the comic book adaptation of The Phantom Menace, which is Star Wars Episode 1. And I watched that video, and he touched upon in that video, and I'm sure he's going to touch upon it more next week when he does another 2 to 3 parter on the Attack of the Clones comic book adaptation. Linkara touched upon Anakin and Padme Amidala's relationship, and how fans look at it as being kind of awkward that in the first episode, you have this 9, 10-year-old Anakin developing, I guess you could say, a crush, a deep friendship, with Amidala, Padme, even going as far as calling her an angel and maybe even looking up to her as a motherly figure or even a big sister, to the point that in Attack of the Clones, all of a sudden, Padme doesn't look like she's aged that much, maybe by a few years. And yet, on the other hand, you have Anakin going from this 9, 10-year-old boy that we see in Phantom Menace to freaking Hayden Christensen in the next two movies. Now, some Star Wars theorists may suggest that because he's the chosen one, he has a connection with the Force, the strongest connection, if you will, that it's because of that connection with the Force that his growth has accelerated and he's grown as quickly as he did in just a few years, unnormally, I should say, unnormally than an average boy should. In other words, a 9, 10-year-old boy could have a growth spurt, but not the way he did. So some Star Wars theorist would kind of say that because he had a connection with the Force, that caused his growth to accelerate, and he went from what he was in Phantom Menace to who he became in the next two movies. Thus would be the justified reason as to him falling for him and Padme's friendship developing into something more, into a romance, and thus a marriage. But what does this have to do with Spike and Rarity? Well, one, we know Spike's not going to go the dark side because he's gone through numerous moments in the series that have not shown him in a bright light, but he has redeemed himself. But what it has to do with Spike and Rarity in comparison to it is throughout the past decade, we have had fans on various sides of the subject explaining why it works and why it doesn't work. You had one fan last year, do a video on the Sparity thing, and even though they weren't a big supporter of it, basically they took time out for about 30-something minutes to explain from an age perspective why it could work. Why, Spike is at the appropriate age to probably be with Rarity despite him being small in size. Kind of very identical, if not similar, to the Anakin situation that Star Wars theorists would throw out there. And that could be true. I mean, you look at how Spike gets portrayed in some of the episodes throughout the series run, and even in some of the issues during its current run, and depending on who writes for him, basically, it seems that he's either portrayed as being a bit childish or being mature, and maybe even more mature than from what he is. So, the question is, though, when you compare the two, as crazy as it sounds, does the Anakin Padme thing justify Spike and Rarity happening in something like My Little Pony? And depending on whether or not you're a fan of both franchises and you kind of look at that comparison, some would say yes and some would say no. Some would say yes because even though it's a different way of, even though it's a different perception of it happening in the MLP, Spike going through what Star Wars theorists would look at as being the physical, if not the mental growth of because of who he is, because of the powers he has, being part of that circle of friendship council of friendship, if you will, being part of the main group, that, because of that, instead of the greed exceeding his growth, which we saw occur temporarily in Secret of My Excess, that the mental growth is the one that, helps him become older and act more mature than what he would look like. I know that sounded kind of weird coming from me in that rambling kind of way, but you get the idea. It's the same way with Anakin. Anakin, because it's, well, not the same way, but it's similar to Anakin's situation, according to Star Wars theorists. That basically, because he has that connection with the Force, it caused his growth, caused him to grow and age a lot quicker than normal. I mean, when you look at Padme in the next two films afterwards, it doesn't seem like she's aged at all. Maybe by a few years, but she's still the same as to when Anakin first met her as a boy. So, yeah, it's a strange comparison to look at, but when one thinks about it, even though Spike may not physically age as quickly as he should to be in the eyes of what some fans would consider the appropriate size maybe to be with Rarity, that mentally he's aged just enough to where, he's at that moment in his life to where he could be with someone like Rarity. He could be with someone like her, and no one would really bat an eye. I mean, again, you have this video out here on YouTube where, this individual, like I said, who's not a fan, basically takes the time out to look at the age situation and decipher from the mythical logic of dragons, depending on how they're raised and how they look at things, that they can age normally but not grow normally, because the growth depends on how greedy they are, and if they're not that greedy, then they just grow just slower than the average dragon. It's and again, as similar as it may sound, or identical as it may sound to the Star Wars situation, Anakin, because he had such a strong connection to the Force, it caused him to grow at an accelerated rate. And if he didn't have that strong connection, who's to say he wouldn't have just grown semi, if not like a normal kid? Who's to say we wouldn't have gotten, I can't think of the young actor's name who portrayed him in the Phantom Menace. Who's to say we wouldn't have saw an older version of that kid just by a few years in Attack of the Clones instead of getting freaking Hayden Christensen? You know what I'm saying? I know I sound like I'm rambling. I do apologize, but the point that I'm trying to get at is this. People hated on Anakin and Padme's relationship. They hated on the fact that this relationship began when Padme basically was someone in her mid to late teens, if not getting out of her early teens, but mid to late teens, and Anakin was just 9-10 years old. And yet we see in the following movies that she doesn't look like she's aged that much, but Anakin's aged exceedingly because of his connection to the Force, his strong connection, if you will. And like I said, it's identical and similar, but maybe in reverse that you look at with Spike and Rarity, because Spike is not as greedy, but more about love and friendship. The maturity part, or which could be looked at like being the Jedi part, is making him grow and become and act older than what he looks. Like, his growth may be slow because he's not as greedy, but the maturity level is the one that really matters the most. I mean, does he still have his moments, throughout? Yeah, there's no doubt. But I think when you look at it from those perspectives, it kind of makes sense. It really does. And again, I know I sound like I'm rambling. I do apologize. It is late and I got to get to bed in a bit. But like I said, it kind of makes sense. It's kind of similar in identity, if you will. But just like with Spike and Rarity, where you have fans that like and don't like the relationship because they feel it doesn't work because of this or that, it's the same way with Anakin and Padme. They just don't. I mean, some people feel that between Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones that they jumped the shark. And that could be true, but like I said, some Star Wars theorists would probably point out that because of Anakin's strong connection with the Force, that connection caused his growth, caused him to grow at an accelerated rate. Basically made him age more rapidly, from a growth perspective and not a maturity perspective. The maturity part, the maturity part, excuse me there. The maturity part wouldn't occur or until like the end of Return of the Jedi. Like throughout episodes 4 and 5 and all that, he would start to mature. He would start to grow into who he was destined to be, until we get his return to being the good guy, the Jedi he was meant to be, the one that was the one that was going to bring the balance to the Force. Or in Return of the Jedi, where he would save his son Luke Skywalker. So, getting down to it, what I'm trying to get at is this. When you look at the two situations, they're identical but in different ways. Spike's maturity is the one that accelerated because he focused more on friendship and caring about others instead of greed. The greed would have caused him to age and grow rapidly, and we saw that once happen in Secret of My Excess, and he regretted it when he returned to normal. But in return, we see him mentally, maturely grow into the character we want him to be, which, in a sense, mentally and mature-wise, causes him to age to the appropriate age that could be with someone like Rarity. Well, you look at someone like Anakin, who basically, because he's studying, of course. Now, some would say he was studying under Obi-Wan Kenobi, and that's fine. But even with the studying under Obi-Wan, it doesn't mean he was maturing quickly. It's like he understood, but he wasn't maturing. He still had the mentality of a kid. And some people do point that out, I'm pretty sure, when it comes to the Star Wars fan base, that the Anakin we got in Attack of the Clones and later on Revenge of the Sith still acted more like a child than, a Jedi Master. So, again, strange comparison, I know, but when you look at the two relationships in the way both Spike and Anakin are portrayed in the respective franchises and how they grow, it kind of makes sense. It kind of has a bit of a connection, but not much. And again, I know, like I said, I know I sound like I'm rambling, but the point I want to get at is when Anakin and Padme got together, people didn't like it because it's like the relationship started already when he was between the two when he was just a 19-year-old kid, and now all of a sudden they're in love and they're married off. By the second or third film, they're married off or something like that, and she's pregnant. They have, they kind of do the thing, and it's like, well, where did this suddenly come from? How did this happen? It just doesn't make sense to them because, Anakin rapidly grows into hating freaking Christensen, and Padme doesn't seem like she's aged that much. And again, some Star Wars theorists could say that it's his connection to the Force that caused that, and that even though he was training, we could see in Attack of the Clones and we can see in Revenge of the Sith that he still has that immaturity factor, that despite all his training and learning and all that, the immaturity factor still plays a major role in him making rash decisions and him easily being manipulated. We could see that. We see that as his character falls to the dark side in the prequels. With Spike, it's the complete opposite. His greed would cause him to become the monstrous dragon, no brains, no nothing kind of deal, only thinking of himself. And that's only happened once, and we don't see it ever. We don't see it ever again after that, because what's really focused on and what really helps him grow into the character that he is and makes him kind of, if not, not just kind of, but makes him legitimately someone that could be with Rarity, is his maturity level. Now, we see him still kind of go towards his dragon tendencies? Yeah, we see it. But in the end, it's the maturity level that that kind of overcomes those dragon tendencies, where he does the right thing, where he makes the right decisions. You know, again, Best Gift Ever is a good example of that, with the fact that even though he let his dragon tendencies allow him to manipulate Fluttershy into doing a trade of names, cutie marks, so he can get rarities, so he can get her a gift, the end result was, instead of buying something, he decided, from a mature standpoint, that something more meaningful from the heart would be appropriate. And even though his first original idea to do a parasail umbrella for her went awry, what he did in the end was probably a better result. And that was all because he let the maturity factor, you know, basically make that maturity factor that he was growing, that had grown within him, kind of help him make the right decision. So, in the end, like I said, it's a strange comparison, but when you take a look at the two relationships, and especially the two male leads in the relationships, you got to ask one thing you do have to ask yourself: what relationship made more sense with what character? Did Anakin's make with Padme A? Did that make more sense than Spike and Rarities, or did Spike and Rarities make more sense than Anakin and Padme's? Again, strange comparison, and I know, like I said, I'm repeating this. I know that I rambled here, but I just wanted to get this off my chest. I want to hear what you guys have to say about it. Let me know down below. Comment if you like. And I am out. Peace.